The dirt outside Caleb Holt's window had gone the color of old bone, cracked into 1,000 small mouths that hadn't tasted rain since the first frost. He stood at the basin each morning and watched it through the warped glass, the way a man watches something he's given up trying to fix. 3 years of drought sitting on 3 years of grief. And he couldn't have told you anymore which one had hollowed him out worse. The homestead had been his father's, and his father's father's before that, a low timber house with a sagging porch roof, a well that groaned more than it gave water, and 400 acres of grazing land that had once fed 200 head of cattle and now barely sustained 60. Caleb was 31 years old and looked closer to 45. His hands cracked and yellow calloused from rope and branding iron, his jaw permanently set in the expression of a man bracing for one more disappointment. He had buried his wife, Sarah, 18 months back. Fever took her in a single brutal week, during the worst of a Montana winter, and since then the house had settled into a silence so complete that Caleb sometimes spoke aloud just to remember the sound of his own voice. He kept her apron on its hook by the stove. He told himself it was practical, that aprons cost money and there was no sense throwing out good cloth. He did not examine the lie too closely. This morning he was up before the sun, as he always was, boiling coffee black as tar over the cook stove and listening to the wind worry at the shutters. The wind out here never really stopped. It came down off the ridge in the evenings smelling of sage and cold stone, and by morning it had turned dry and restless, pushing dust under the door in fine pale drifts that Caleb swept out with the same broom every single day. A ritual as much as a chore. Outside, his one remaining ranch hand, an aging Mexican vaquero named Tomas, was already saddling the horses for the morning ride out to check the south fence line, his breath fogging faint in the cold. Caleb drank his coffee standing at the window, the tin cup warming his palm, and looked out at the land the way other men might look at a debt they knew they could never repay. The grass had thinned to brittle yellow stalks. The creek that cut along the eastern boundary had shrunk to a trickle a man could step over without wetting his boot, and somewhere past the ridge, beyond sight but never far from thought, sat the bank in town, Whitfield's bank, holding a mortgage note that grew heavier with every dry month that passed. He set the cup down harder than he meant to. There were things a man could fight with his hands. A stubborn calf, a busted wagon wheel, a fence line torn open by elk, and there were things a man could only wait out, helpless as a stone in a riverbed, watching the water rise around him and knowing it might just keep rising until it swallowed everything he had. The drought was the second kind, so was the grief. So, if he was honest with himself in the gray hour before dawn when honesty came cheaper, was the unbearable quiet of a house built for 2 people, and now holding only 1. He had stopped expecting anything from the days. That was, he supposed, the only mercy of it. A man who expects nothing cannot be disappointed twice in the same week. He rose at 4, worked until dark, ate whatever Thomas's wife sent over in a covered dish, and slept the heavy, dreamless sleep of pure exhaustion. Because exhaustion was kinder than memory. It was Thomas who broke into these thoughts, rapping twice on the doorframe before stepping half inside, hat already in his weathered hands. "Patron," he said, in the careful, economical way he had of speaking, as though words too were a resource not to be wasted. "Town's talking, school board's looking to hire a teacher before the new term. They sent word asking if any of the outlying families might board one, seeing as the schoolhouse got no room of its own." Caleb didn't turn from the window right away. He thought of the empty room at the back of the house, Sarah's sewing room, untouched since the fever, the door kept shut more out of habit than intention. He thought of a stranger's footsteps on those floorboards, a stranger's voice carrying down that hallway where now there was nothing but his own. "Tell them I've got no use for boarders," he said finally, though something in his chest had gone tight and uncertain, like a man standing at the edge of water he wasn't sure he wanted to test. Thomas only nodded, the way he nodded at most things, and turned to go saddle the horses. But the wind picked up just then, rattling the loose shutter on the western wall, the one Caleb kept meaning to fix and never did, and for one strange, suspended moment, Caleb Holt stood very still in his silent kitchen, coffee going cold in his hand, and felt, for the first time in 18 months, the unsettling sensation of waiting for something he could not yet name. The stagecoach from Bozeman arrived on a Tuesday, 3 days after Caleb had told Tomas he wanted no boarders. And it arrived precisely because the world has a way of ignoring what a man wants when his need is greater than his pride. It was Reverend Whitcomb who came to the ranch that afternoon, his buggy rattling up the dirt track with a haste that told Caleb something had already gone sideways before a single word was spoken. The Reverend was a stout man, given to sweating through his collar even in cool weather, and he didn't bother dismounting before he started talking. "Holt, need a word." He wiped his brow with a kerchief gone gray from overuse. "The Pearson place burned its boarding room down to the studs last night. Lamp oil, far as anyone can tell. No injuries, praise God, but it leaves us in a bind. The new schoolteacher's already on her way, due in by coach this very afternoon, and there's nowhere in town fit to put her up before the term starts." Caleb felt the same tightness return to his chest that had visited him 3 days prior. "Reverend, I already told Tomas. I know what you told Tomas." Whitcomb didn't raise his voice, but there was a weight to it that came from years of talking grieving men into doing things they didn't want to do. "And I know why. But you've got a room standing empty, Holt, and a young woman's got nowhere to sleep tonight but the floor of the mercantile. The board will pay for her keep, $3 a week. Fair money in times like these. It's a month, maybe 2, until the Pearsons rebuild. That's all I'm asking." Caleb looked past the Reverend toward the ridge, where the afternoon light was already beginning its long, slow fall toward evening, gilding the dry grass in a color that almost looked like wealth. $3 a week wasn't nothing. The mortgage note sat in his desk drawer like a held breath, and pride, he reminded himself, had never once kept a roof from leaking. "A month," Caleb said. 2 at the outside. And she keeps to herself." "She seems the sort who would," Whitcomb said, something almost like relief loosening his shoulders. "Quiet as a held breath, that one. Came recommended from a school out past Helena. Lost her own people some years back, I'm told, though she don't speak of it." The coach arrived an hour before sunset, dust-streaked and groaning on its axles, and Caleb stood on the porch with his hat in his hands, feeling like a man at his own trial. The door opened and a young woman stepped down without assistance, refusing the driver's offered hand with a small, polite shake of her head that told Caleb everything he needed to know about her independence before she'd said a single word. She was perhaps 25, dressed in plain traveling gray, her dark hair pinned back severe and practical beneath a modest bonnet. She carried one worn carpet bag in a wooden case that Caleb guessed held books, and she carried them herself, setting them down at her feet with the careful economy of someone accustomed to having no one to carry things for her. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. She looked at the house, at the sagging porch roof, the swept dirt yard, the dry land stretching gold and brittle behind it, and something crossed her face that wasn't quite disappointment and wasn't quite relief, but some quiet third thing that Caleb couldn't name. Then her eyes found his, and held there. They were pale gray-green, the color of sage before a storm, and there was a steadiness in them that unsettled him more than any words could have. She did not look away first. Caleb realized with some discomfort that he was the one who eventually broke the gaze, glancing down at the carpetbag instead. "Miss," he said by way of greeting, the single word costing him more effort than it should have. "Mr. Holt." Her voice was low, measured, betraying nothing. "I understand I'm to board here." "Reckon you are." Silence stretched between them again, thick as the dust in the yard, broken only by the wind moving through the dry grass and the distant lowing of cattle settling for the evening. She did not ask about the house or the room or what might be expected of her. She simply waited, watching him with that same unblinking patience, as though she had already decided that whatever came next, she intended to meet it standing. Caleb picked up her carpetbag before she could object, and as his fingers brushed the worn leather handle, he felt something shift inside his chest. Small, almost imperceptible, like the first crack spreading slow across dry earth before the first rain finally comes. The trouble announced itself before supper was even on the table. Caleb had shown her Miss Eleanor Vance she'd finally offered, somewhere between the porch and the hallway, to Sarah's old sewing room, now stripped down to a narrow bed, a washstand, and a single chair Thomas had carried over that morning. He'd said little beyond the practical. Water came from the pump out back. Supper was at 6, the privy was past the smokehouse. She'd nodded at each instruction with the same composed economy she seemed to apply to everything, and then she'd asked, almost as an afterthought, whether there was somewhere she might draw water to wash the dust of 3 days' travel from her hands. It was on the walk back from the well, her tin basin balanced careful against her hip, that the bucket rope gave out. The well rope at the Holt place had been fraying for the better part of a year. One more small repair pushed down a list of larger ones, the kind of neglect that accumulates in a house run by a single grieving man stretched too thin across too much land. Caleb heard the crack of it snapping before he saw what had happened, and by the time he came around the side of the house, Eleanor was standing at the well's edge staring down into the dark throat of it, the bucket gone, the frayed rope end still clutched in her hand. "It's down there," she said, without turning around, in the same level voice she'd used all afternoon. Not panic, not apology, Simply a statement of fact, delivered to a man she'd known for less than 2 hours. Reckon it is. Caleb came to stand beside her, peering down into the dark. The well wasn't deep, maybe 20 feet to the waterline, but it was the only working well within a half-mile. And a homestead without water was a homestead in genuine trouble. Rope's been needing replacing a while now. Just hadn't got to it. I see. She said it without accusation, though something in the dry economy of the words made Caleb feel the neglect more sharply than if she'd scolded him outright. There was a coil of fresh rope in the barn, and a grappling hook Caleb's father had fashioned years back for exactly this purpose, and the two of them fell, almost without discussing it, into the practical business of fishing the bucket back out. Caleb worked the hook down on the new rope while Eleanor held the lantern steady against the gathering dusk, her arm not wavering once despite the weight of holding it raised for the better part of 10 minutes. "Hold it there," he said when the hook finally caught. "Don't let the light swing." "I'm not in the habit of letting things swing, Mr. Holt." There was something almost dry in the way she said it. Not quite humor, but adjacent to it, a glimpse of something sharper than her composed exterior had shown so far. Caleb glanced up at her, surprised into something close to a smile, though he caught it before it fully formed. "No," he said. "Reckon you're not." They worked the bucket up together after that, Caleb pulling while Eleanor steadied the rope from below to keep it from scraping against the stone lip of the well, and when the bucket finally broke the surface, dripping and battered but whole, neither of them said anything for a moment. It was a small victory, the kind that wouldn't have meant much on its own, but standing there in the deepening blue of evening with the lantern between them and the well rope newly mended, it felt to Caleb like the first thing that had gone right on this homestead in longer than he cared to count. "Thank you," Eleanor said, taking the basin he refilled for her, "for not making more of it than it was. Wasn't your fault the rope was old? Most men would have found a way to make it feel like it was." Caleb had no answer for that, so he said nothing, and watched her walk back toward the house with the basin held steady against her hip, her dark traveling dress catching the last gold light of evening. The wind had picked up again, carrying the smell of dry sage and turned earth, and somewhere behind the ridge a coyote called once into the gathering dark. He stood by the well a moment longer than he needed to, coiling the spare rope with hands that had gone slightly unsteady, and found himself wondering, with a kind of quiet, unwelcome curiosity he hadn't felt in 18 months, what other small fractures in this homestead Miss Eleanor Vance might notice before her month was through. The days fell into a rhythm neither of them named aloud, but both seemed to recognize for what it was. Eleanor rose early, earlier even than Caleb expected, given she'd no cattle to tend or fences to mend. He found her on the third morning already at the cook stove, sleeves pushed back, working coffee grounds into the battered pot with the careful precision of someone who'd learned to make do with little and waste nothing. She did not ask where things belonged in his kitchen. She simply opened cupboards until she found what she needed, and by the time Caleb came through from the yard smelling of horse and cold morning air, there was a plate of biscuits cooling on the table that hadn't been there the night before. "Didn't ask you to cook," he said, not unkindly, hanging his hat by the door. "You didn't ask me not to, either." She didn't look up from the stove. Seemed wasteful, two people keeping separate fires under one roof. He couldn't argue the logic of it, so he didn't try. He ate the biscuits better than anything he'd managed himself in 18 months and said nothing more on the matter, though something in his chest noted the gesture and filed it away with a kind of cautious gratitude he wasn't yet ready to examine. The arrangement that emerged over the following days was never discussed outright. It simply accumulated, the way trust does between people too proud or too wounded to speak it directly. Eleanor took to splitting kindling in the mornings before her walk into town for school preparations, awkwardly at first, her grip wrong on the hatchet handle, until Caleb, watching from the woodpile one morning, stepped in without a word and adjusted her hands lower on the haft. "Let the weight do the work," he said. "You're fighting the axe instead of letting it fall." She tried again, and the wood split clean, and something crossed her face that might have been satisfaction or might have been surprise at her own capability. She didn't thank him. She simply nodded once, filed the lesson away, and by the end of the week was splitting kindling with an efficiency that made Caleb wonder how much of her composure was simple stubbornness dressed up as poise. In turn, Caleb found himself doing small things he hadn't bothered with in months, mending the loose shutter on the western wall, the one he'd let rattle through a dozen windstorms, fixing the third porch step that had threatened to swallow a careless boot since spring. He told himself these were repairs long overdue regardless of who occupied the sewing room. He did not examine too closely why he'd suddenly found the motivation to address them now. Evenings brought their own quiet choreography. Eleanor graded slates and prepared lesson cards at the kitchen table by lamplight while Caleb worked leather repairs or oiled tack at the other end. the silence between them companionable rather than empty in a way the house hadn't held since Sarah. Neither spoke much. When they did, it was practical. A question about the well's reliability, a comment on the dryness of the season, Eleanor asking once carefully whether the cattle would manage through summer if the creek kept shrinking. "They'll manage," Caleb said, though he wasn't entirely certain it was true. "Always have." She studied him a moment in the lamplight, that same unhurried, sage-colored gaze he was beginning to recognize and, despite himself, anticipate. "And if they don't?" It was the first question anyone had asked him in months that actually wanted an honest answer, not a reassurance. Caleb set down the bridle he'd been working and considered it seriously, the way her question seemed to deserve. "Then I suppose I'll have to figure something else," he said finally. "Same as always." Eleanor returned to her slates without further comment, but Caleb noticed, the way he was noticing more things lately than he had any right to, that she'd left the lamp burning a little longer that night, neither of them quite ready to be the one who said it was time for sleep. Outside, the wind had gentled to a low, steady murmur through the dry grass, and for the first time and longer than he could properly account for, Caleb Holt sat in his own kitchen and felt something that wasn't quite peace but was perhaps its careful beginning. The letter came on a Thursday, carried out from town by Thomas along with the week's mail, and Caleb knew before he'd even broken the seal that it would not be good news. Bank correspondence had a particular weight to it, a particular crispness of paper that announced itself before a single word was read. He waited until Eleanor had left for the schoolhouse before he opened it at the kitchen table, the morning light falling pale and unforgiving across the page. "Mr. Holt," it read, in the cramped, deliberate hand of Edgar Whitfield, president of the First Bank of Larkspur Hollow. "This letter serves as formal notice that the note secured against your property, originally due in full this coming October, must now be addressed no later than the 1st of September, owing to changes in the bank's reserve requirements following recent regional difficulties. The outstanding balance, with accrued interest, stands at $1,840. Failure to satisfy this obligation by the stated date will result in foreclosure proceedings against the property in question." Caleb read it twice, then a third time, as though repetition might soften the arithmetic of it. $1,840 was a sum that might as well have been 18,000, given what the drought had done to his herd and what little the dried-up grazing land could fetch at market. He had perhaps 2 months now instead of 5, and a ranch that was producing less with each passing week of rainless sky. He folded the letter and set it beneath the bread tin, the same drawer where he kept the original mortgage papers, as though hiding the words might somehow delay their consequence. It was foolish, he knew, to think Whitfield's sudden urgency had nothing to do with the man's long-standing interest in the Holt land, 400 acres of creek-fed grazing ground that bordered the new rail spur survey, land that would fetch triple its current worth the moment the railroad made its intentions official. Caleb had heard the rumors, same as everyone in Larkspur Hollow. He'd simply never imagined Whitfield would move to call the note early, not with the ink barely dry on the original terms. He spent the day working harder than usual, the kind of labor a man takes up specifically to keep his mind from a problem it cannot yet solve. Mending fence line that didn't strictly need mending, walking the dry creek bed twice over as though sheer attention might coax water from stone. By the time Eleanor returned from the schoolhouse in the late afternoon, dust on her hem and a stack of slates under one arm, Caleb had said perhaps a dozen words to another living soul all day, and every one of them had been to the cattle. She noticed. He should have known she would. Noticing things seemed to be the one constant beneath her composed exterior. "You've gone quiet," she said, setting the slates on the table. "Quieter than your usual quiet, which I confess I hadn't thought possible. Lot on my mind." He didn't look up from the bridle he was oiling, though his hands had gone still on the leather some minutes back without his noticing. "Would it help to speak it, or would you rather I not ask?" It was, Caleb thought, a remarkably honest question, not the false concern of someone fishing for gossip, nor the hollow reassurance people offered when they didn't actually want to hear the answer. She was simply asking plainly whether her asking would be welcome. "Banks moved the note up," he heard himself say, the words coming out before he'd fully decided to share them. "September now, not October. Near $2,000, with the herd half what it should be, and the creek going dry as the road." Eleanor was quiet a moment, absorbing this with the same careful attention she gave everything. "That's a considerable sum to find in 2 months." "It is. Is there a reason for the sudden change? Banks don't often move faster than they have to." Caleb looked up at her then, surprised by the sharpness of the question, the way it cut directly to the suspicion he'd been turning over in his own mind without quite naming it. "There's talk of a rail spur coming through. Land like this would be worth considerably more once that's official. Something settled over Eleanor's face. Not surprise, but a kind of grim recognition, as though she'd encountered this particular shape of trouble before in some other life she hadn't yet spoken of. Then I'd say, Mr. Holt, that you're not simply fighting a drought. No, Caleb said, the weight of it finally settling fully into his chest. Reckon I'm not. Outside, the wind had picked up again, dry and restless against the shutters, carrying with it the first faint, ominous taste of a season that had not yet decided how much more it intended to take from him. It happened on a Sunday, the one day Eleanor didn't walk into town for school business, when the ordinary rhythm of chores gave way to something slower and less structured. Caleb had asked her, somewhat awkwardly, whether she'd mind helping mend a torn section of the porch awning before the next windstorm took it entirely. Needle and heavy threadwork, more suited to careful hands than his own calloused ones. They sat together on the porch steps in the mild afternoon light, Eleanor's sleeves pushed back to keep them clear of the canvas, and it was in reaching for the spool of thread that her cuff rode up far enough to expose the pale underside of her forearm. Caleb saw it before he could think better of looking, a scar, old and silvered with age, running in a jagged line from wrist nearly to elbow. The kind of mark that didn't come from careless accident but from something deliberate and violent. He looked away quickly, embarrassed at having seen what clearly wasn't meant for casual observation, but not quickly enough. Eleanor noticed him notice. She didn't flinch, didn't snatch her sleeve back down in the reflexive shame he half expected. She simply continued threading her needle, though something in the set of her shoulders had gone slightly more rigid than before. "You may ask," she said finally, not looking up from her work. "I'd rather that than have you wondering in silence for the next month." Caleb considered deflecting, telling her it wasn't his business, that she owed him no explanations. But something in the careful permission she'd offered seemed to deserve honesty in return. "Didn't mean to stare. I know you didn't." She finished knotting the thread before continuing, her voice even but quieter than usual, pitched for just the two of them despite the empty yard around them. "It's from a fire. Some years back now. My father's schoolhouse, out past Helena, where I first learned to teach alongside him." She said it plainly, the way she said most things, but Caleb noticed the careful distance in her phrasing. A fire, not the fire that took everything, though something in her face suggested the two were the same. "Lamp oil, same as the Pearsons' place," she continued. "Tipped during a lesson, caught the curtains before anyone could stop it. I got the children out. My father went back in for the school records, the enrollment books, thinking there was time." She paused, the needle stilled in her hand. "There wasn't." Caleb said nothing for a long moment, the weight of what she'd just offered settling between them with a gravity that words seemed inadequate to address. He thought of his own father's death, sudden and unceremonious in a fall from a half-broken horse, and recognized something of his own grief reflected back at him in the careful, controlled way she spoke of hers, the particular discipline of someone who had learned that falling apart helped no one, least of all the dead. "I'm sorry," he said finally, the words feeling thin against what they were meant to carry. "As am I." She returned to her stitching, though her hands had gone slightly less steady than before. "It's why I took the position here, if you're wondering. Helena held too many rooms that still smelled of smoke when the wind turned a certain way. I needed somewhere that didn't remember him." Caleb understood that particular hunger better than he cared to admit. The desperate, exhausting search for a place untouched by what you'd lost. It was, he realized with some discomfort, the same hunger that had kept him alone on this homestead for 18 months, refusing boarders, refusing company, as though solitude itself might somehow preserve what little remained of Sarah's memory rather than simply prolonging the ache of her absence. "This place remembers plenty," he said, surprising himself with the admission. "My wife. 18 months passed now. Fever took her quick, faster than anyone expected." Eleanor looked up at him then, and for the first time since her arrival, the careful composure in her gray-green eyes gave way to something rawer. Not pity, which Caleb would have resented, but a kind of clear-eyed recognition. Two people examining the same particular shape of loss from different angles and finding it disturbingly familiar. "Then we're neither of us strangers to grief that doesn't announce itself before it arrives," she said quietly. "No," Caleb agreed, watching the afternoon light shift gold across the dry yard, the scar on her arm now sleeve-covered once more but not forgotten. "Reckon we're not." Neither of them spoke again for some time, the needle moving steady through canvas, the wind stirring soft through the porch eaves, but something had shifted between them in the telling, small, quiet, and entirely unspoken, like a door left deliberately ajar. The storm rolled in without much warning, the way they tended to in late summer when the dry heat finally broke against itself. By supper time the sky had gone a bruised, heavy purple, and by the time Caleb had the last of the cattle settled and the barn doors latched against the wind, the first fat drops of rain were already striking the dry earth with a sound like distant gunfire. It was the first real rain in months, and despite the danger of the lightning now forking white across the western sky, Caleb felt something loosen in his chest at the sound of it drumming against the roof. Relief tangled up with a strange, mournful ache, the way grief sometimes surfaces hardest in moments of unexpected mercy. Eleanor had the fire built up high by the time he came in from the barn, soaked through despite his oilskin coat, and she said nothing about his dripping state beyond setting a towel within reach and pouring coffee strong enough to stand a spoon in. They sat near the hearth as the storm worsened outside, the wind throwing rain hard against the shutters, lightning illuminating the kitchen in brief, stark flashes that made the shadows leap and retreat. "First real rain since spring," Caleb said, watching the flames rather than her. "The grass will be grateful for it." Eleanor had her knees drawn up slightly, an unusually informal posture for a woman who carried herself with such consistent composure. But the storm seemed to have loosened something in both of them. Whether it comes soon enough to matter for the bank's purposes is another question entirely. Caleb didn't answer that directly. The mortgage sat heavier on him with each passing day, the September deadline drawing closer with no clear path toward the sum required. But tonight, with the fire crackling and the rain finally breaking the long drought, he found he didn't want to spend the hour dwelling on Whitfield's letter. "You never told me," he said instead, "what brought you west in the first place. Past the fire, I mean." "There's towns closer to Helena than this one." Eleanor was quiet long enough that he thought she might deflect the question entirely the way she'd deflected smaller ones in the early days of her boarding. But the storm seemed to have softened something in her too. Or perhaps it was simply that the door, once opened on the porch steps, had proven difficult to close again. "My father wasn't only my teacher," she said finally, watching the fire rather than him, the orange light catching the silver threading through her dark hair that Caleb hadn't noticed before. "After my mother died birthing my younger brother, it was the two of us, 3 when my brother was old enough to help with lessons. The schoolhouse wasn't merely where we worked, it was where we lived, in the rooms behind the main hall. When the fire took it, it didn't only take the building." She paused, and Caleb understood without her saying it that she meant her brother too, the boy who hadn't been mentioned until this moment and likely hadn't survived whatever Caleb had assumed was a fire contained to the schoolhouse proper. "He was 11, she said quietly, confirming what Caleb had already guessed. "Sleeping in the back room when it caught. By the time I'd gotten the older children clear, there wasn't time to reach him too. My father went back for the records. I went back for Daniel. Neither of us came out with what we went in for." The rain continued its steady assault against the roof, the fire popping softly in the grate, and Caleb found he had no adequate words for what she'd just handed him. The particular horror of a choice made in seconds that would echo for the rest of a life, the impossible arithmetic of who you tried to save when you couldn't save everyone. "That scar," he said quietly, understanding now. "Going back in for him. I didn't reach him in time, but I tried." Her voice remained level, though something in it had gone thin and careful, the voice of someone who had told this story to herself 1,000 times in the dark, and had only now, for the first time, spoken it aloud to another living soul. "I've never told anyone the whole of it, not even the school board, when they hired me. They know there was a fire. They don't know there was a Daniel." Caleb reached over, without entirely deciding to, and set his hand briefly over hers where it rested on her knee, not holding, simply present, the way you might steady something fragile without presuming to claim it. Eleanor didn't pull away. She turned her hand slightly beneath his, just enough that her fingers curled loose around his calloused palm, and the two of them sat that way in the firelight as the storm raged on outside. Two people who had each carried their grief alone for too long, finally setting a small portion of its weight down together. The storm had cleared by morning, leaving the homestead washed clean and strange in its sudden green. Caleb stood on the porch before dawn, coffee in hand, and looked out at land he barely recognized. The dry, brittle grass had darkened overnight to something closer to its proper color. The dust settled into mud that would, in a day or two, firm back into soil that might actually hold a crop. It was, he thought, the first morning in 18 months that hadn't felt like a slow accumulation of loss. Eleanor joined him on the porch a few minutes later, 2 cups in hand, though she'd already brought one out for him, and they stood together in companionable silence, watching the sun break properly over the ridge for what felt like the first time in months. Neither of them mentioned the previous night directly, the held hands, the fire, the names finally spoken aloud. But something in the easy quiet between them now carried a different quality than before, less the careful peace of two strangers and more the comfortable stillness of two people who had stopped being strangers somewhere in the telling. "Thomas says the creek will run again within the week if this keeps up," Caleb said, nodding toward the now green eastern boundary. "First real water we've had since spring. Then perhaps your luck has finally turned." Eleanor sipped her coffee, watching the light spread gold across the wet grass. "Though I confess I've learned to be cautious of believing in turned luck too quickly. It has a way of disappointing those who trust it too soon." "Cautious is reasonable," Caleb said. "Don't suppose I've earned the right to expect things to come easy." "Nor have I." "'Cause you actually add a sideways sum. A false, I meant said, I something almost like humor warming her usually composed expression. "Though I'll admit, this particular morning makes the caution somewhat harder to maintain." They spent the day in a kind of unspoken truce against the world's larger troubles. The mortgage note, the September deadline, all of it set quietly aside in favor of the small, immediate pleasures the rain had afforded them. Caleb walked the property with Thomas to assess what damage the storm had done, finding it mercifully minor, while Eleanor took advantage of the cooler, washed air to air out the schoolhouse slates and lesson materials that had grown musty in the summer heat. By late afternoon, with chores mostly done and the light beginning its long gold slide toward evening, Caleb found Eleanor sitting on the porch steps again, this time without mending work in hand, simply watching the sunset color the wet grass in shades of amber and rose. He sat beside her without asking, and she didn't object, the two of them watching the day end in a silence that had become, over these past weeks, something closer to comfortable than awkward. "I keep thinking," Eleanor said eventually, "about how strange it is that a fire destroyed everything I had, and yet here I am, in a stranger's home, finding something almost like peace." "Not strangers anymore, I'd reckon." "No," she agreed softly. "Not anymore." The admission sat between them, simple and unadorned, but carrying a weight that both of them seemed to recognize without needing to elaborate further. Caleb thought of the empty house he'd maintained for 18 months, the silence he'd mistaken for a kind of fidelity to Sarah's memory, and understood now, watching the sunset beside a woman who had taught him more about grief's particular geometry in a few short weeks than he'd learned in a year and a half of solitary mourning, that there was a difference between honoring what you'd lost and simply refusing to let anything new take root. "This place," he said slowly, working the words out as he found them, "it's felt different since you came, fuller, somehow. Don't rightly know how to say it better than that." Eleanor was quiet a moment, watching the last of the light fade behind the ridge. "This might just stand the same, though I worry sometimes about what it means to find comfort somewhere I know is only temporary. The Pearsons will rebuild eventually. The arrangement was never meant to last beyond that." It was the first time either of them had spoken directly of the arrangement's inevitable end, and Caleb felt something tighten in his chest at the reminder, the awareness, suddenly sharp and unwelcome, that whatever was growing quietly between them existed under a deadline as real and looming as the bank's own. "Reckon we'll cross that bridge when it comes," he said finally, though the words felt thinner than he wanted them to. "Reckon we will," Eleanor agreed, and reached over to take his hand again, this time without hesitation, as the last light faded fully from the sky and the first stars began their slow emergence over land that, for the first time in longer than either of them cared to admit, finally felt something like whole. The wagon came up the drive on the last day of August, 2 days before Whitfield's deadline, and Caleb recognized the bank president's matched grays before he could make out the man himself in the driver's seat. Edgar Whitfield was a narrow man who dressed expensively for a town the size of Larkspur Hollow, and he climbed down from his wagon with the unhurried confidence of someone who had already decided how this conversation would end. Caleb met him in the yard, Eleanor watching from the porch with Thomas beside her, the three of them forming an uneasy audience to whatever Whitfield had driven out to say. "Mr. Holt." Whitfield's smile was thin and practiced. "I trust you've given thought to your situation. I've $1,840 I don't have, and 2 days to find it," Caleb said flatly. "Reckon that's all the thought there is to give. Then perhaps it's time we discussed an alternative." Whitfield withdrew a folded paper from his coat. "The bank is prepared to purchase the property outright, forgive the note entirely, and pay you a fair sum beyond it for your trouble. $1,100, on top of the canceled debt. A man could start fresh somewhere else with that. Somewhere the land hasn't turned against him. This land hasn't turned against me. The sky has." Caleb didn't reach for the paper. And we both know $1,100 is a fraction of what this place will fetch once that rail spur's announced official. Something flickered across Whitfield's composed face, not quite surprise but the particular discomfort of a man caught knowing more than he'd intended to reveal. I'm not certain what rumors you've been listening to. Don't need rumors, just need eyes. Caleb's voice stayed level, though something hard had settled into it. You moved my note up 5 months early the same season survey men started walking the county. That's not coincidence, Whitfield. That's a man trying to steal land cheap before the price goes up. The yard had gone very quiet, the only sound the restless shifting of Whitfield's grays and the distant call of a meadowlark from the now green pasture beyond. Eleanor had come down from the porch without Caleb quite noticing, standing close enough that he could feel her presence beside him like a second spine. "Mr. Whitfield," she said, her schoolteacher's voice carrying clean and precise across the yard. "I believe what Mr. Holt is suggesting is that this arrangement constitutes something closer to fraud than business. I'd imagine the Territorial Banking Commission might take considerable interest in a note moved up 5 months ahead of contracted terms, timed suspiciously alongside privileged knowledge of an unannounced rail survey." Whitfield's jaw tightened. "I'm not sure what authority a schoolteacher has to— None at all. Beyond the ability to write a clear letter and the patience to see it delivered to the appropriate territorial office in Helena." Eleanor's tone remained perfectly pleasant, which somehow made the threat land harder than if she'd raised her voice. "I do happen to have connections there still, from my father's years teaching. People who'd find this story quite interesting, I'd imagine." The silence that followed stretched long enough that Caleb watched something calculate behind Whitfield's eyes, the particular arithmetic of a man weighing exposure against profit, deciding whether $1,100 and a quiet land grab was worth the risk of a commission inquiry. "The offer stands until the deadline," Whitfield said finally, his voice tighter than before. "September 1st. After that, foreclosure proceeds as written in the original note, regardless of what letters get sent where." "Then I reckon we'll see you September 1st, Caleb said, "though I'd think hard before you show up expecting an empty house." Whitfield climbed back into his wagon without further pleasantries, the grays pulling him back down the drive at a pace just hurried enough to betray the composure he'd arrived with. Caleb watched until the wagon disappeared past the ridge, then turned to find Eleanor watching him with an expression he hadn't seen from her before, something fierce and steady beneath the usual composure, like banked coals finally showing their heat. "You didn't have to do that," he said quietly. "The commission letter. I know precisely what I had to do, Mr. Holt, and precisely what I chose to." She held his gaze, sage green eyes unflinching in the harsh afternoon light. "I've lost enough to men who thought patience and silence were the same as weakness. I won't watch it happen again to someone I third." She stopped herself there, the unfinished sentence hanging heavy in the warm air between them, but Caleb heard the shape of what she hadn't said clearly enough regardless. He reached for her hand, and this time neither of them hesitated, the two of them standing together in the yard as the meadowlark called again from the green and growing pasture, 2 days remaining before everything either of them had built here would be tested past anything that had come before. September 1st arrived gray and still, the kind of stillness that felt less like calm than held breath. Caleb had spent the previous 2 days riding to every neighboring rancher he trusted, calling in old debts of friendship rather than money, and by the morning of the deadline he'd assembled what amounted to a small, unlikely army gathered in his yard, not soldiers but witnesses, a dozen men and women from across the county who'd heard, through channels Caleb suspected led back to Eleanor's careful letter writing, exactly what Whitfield had attempted. Whitfield's wagon came up the drive at precisely 10 o'clock, and Caleb watched the banker's composure falter slightly at the sight of the gathered crowd. Tomas and his wife, 3 neighboring ranching families, even Reverend Whitcomb standing solemn near the porch steps, and beside Caleb himself, Eleanor holding a folded letter of her own. "Mr. Holt." Whitfield climbed down more carefully than he had the previous visit. "I see you've gathered an audience for what should be a straightforward business matter." "Figured a man ought to have witnesses," Caleb said, "given the nature of business you've been conducting." Eleanor stepped forward then, unfolding her letter with deliberate calm. "Mr. Whitfield, I wrote to the Territorial Banking Commission in Helena, as I mentioned I might. I received a reply yesterday, by special courier." She held the letter out, though she didn't hand it over. "They've opened a formal inquiry into the timing of this note's acceleration, particularly given testimony from 2 separate surveyors confirming the rail spur route was known to certain Larkspur Hollow parties as early as June, a full 2 months before you informed Mr. Holt of any change in terms." The color drained slowly from Whitfield's face as Eleanor spoke, the gathered crowd watching in a silence that had taken on the particular electric quality of a held verdict. "This is highly irregular. Whitfield managed. So is moving a 5-month-old note up by a third of its term, the same season you stood to profit considerably from the land it's secured against, Eleanor replied, her schoolteacher's precision cutting cleaner than any raised voice could have. The commission has requested you appear in Helena within the fortnight to address these concerns. I'd imagine, given the circumstances, that proceeding with foreclosure today would only add weight to an already troubling case. Whitfield looked between the letter, the gathered crowd, and Caleb's steady, unflinching gaze, and something in his calculating expression finally crumbled into something closer to defeat. The note's terms can revert to the original October deadline, he said stiffly, pending resolution of this inquiry. October deadline, Caleb repeated, and a written acknowledgement witnessed by everyone here that the terms are restored as originally contracted. It took the better part of an hour to draft and sign the document properly, Whitfield's hand visibly unsteady as he wrote, but by the time his wagon disappeared back down the drive, considerably less composed than its arrival, Caleb stood in his yard holding proof that the homestead was, for now, safe. October would still bring its own reckoning, the actual sum still owed, but October was a problem with time enough to solve it, and that alone felt like the first real victory in longer than he could properly measure. The crowd dispersed slowly through the afternoon, well-wishes and handshakes trailing behind them, until only Caleb and Eleanor remained standing in the yard as evening began its slow gold descent. The green grass from the recent rains stretched out around them, the creek audible now in the distance, running properly for the first time in months. "You saved this place," Caleb said quietly, "near as much as I did." "We saved it," Eleanor corrected, taking his hand the way she'd done now without hesitation for days. "I don't believe either of us managed it alone." Caleb looked at her then, really looked, the way he hadn't allowed himself to since Sarah, afraid of what wanting something again might mean, and found that the fear had quietly transformed itself, somewhere across these past weeks of shared chores and confessed grief and stormlit confidences, into something steadier and far less frightening than he'd expected. "Eleanor, why," he said, "I know the Pearsons' place'll be rebuilt before long. Know your boarding here was never meant to last." "I know it too," she said softly. "Don't much want it to end, all the same." Something warm and unguarded broke across her composed features then, the first truly unrestrained smile Caleb had seen from her since her arrival. "Neither do I, Mr. Holt," she said. "Neither do I." The wind moved soft and warm across the yard, carrying the smell of wet earth and growing grass, and the two of them stood together in the gold evening light, two people who had each carried their grief alone for far too long, finally choosing, deliberately and without reservation, to carry whatever came next together instead.